Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The world of Harry Potter is full of characters with a great sense of humour. But let's be honest. When it comes to true kings of pranks and laughter, the crown goes to Fred and George Weasley. The twins turned even Hogwarts' darkest days into a full-blown circus. Laughter, explosions, fireworks, there was no stopping them. But like any coin, their jokes had another side. Sometimes they went too far. Today, let's talk about those very moments. Enjoy watching. Number 1. First years as test subjects. Before launching their legendary shop Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, Fred and George tested their products wherever they could, and on whoever they could. More specifically, first-year students. The youngest, most trusting kids became their guinea pigs. Hermione was furious, and the hospital wing was overflowing. Is it really a joke if you end up under a vomiting solution 4? Number 2. Snowballs at Professor Quirrell. Winter, Harry's first year. Snowballs outside, Filch yelling inside. It seemed innocent enough. Enchanted snowballs chasing poor Quirrell all around the castle. But later we find out that Voldemort himself was hiding under Quirrell's turban. So the twins, unknowingly, were pelting the Dark Lord with enchanted snowballs. Funny in hindsight, maybe. But at the time, it was just bullying a sick, stuttering teacher. Not their finest moment. Number 3, Teddy Bear turns to trauma. Everyone knows Ron fears spiders, but do you know where that fear came from? When Ron was just 3, Fred and George, in revenge for a broken toy broomstick, turned his beloved teddy bear into a giant spider. For a toddler, it was a living nightmare. That joke left a lifelong scar. Welcome to the memory therapy ward. Number 4, Egyptian trap for Percy. Percy Weasley, the model student, order-loving prefect, proud big brother. But even during a family trip to Egypt, his siblings couldn't leave him alone. The twins tried to lock him inside an ancient pyramid. Picture it, darkness, ancient traps, and their older brother screaming from inside a sarcophagus. Funny? Maybe. Dangerous? Definitely. Number 5, Montague's vanishing nightmare. Montague, a fellow student, fell victim to one of their cruelest pranks. The twins shoved him into a vanishing cabinet, but instead of popping out somewhere fun, he got trapped between 2 dimensions. He was literally stuck between Hogwarts and Nocturne Alley until he finally managed to apparate, a highly risky move for a student. Fred and George talked about it like they'd just spilled pumpkin juice on someone's robes. Number 6. The unbreakable vow, flirting with death. The unbreakable vow. A magical oath, you die if you break. And they almost got 5-year-old Ron to take one. Fred and George thought it would be funny. Would it have worked? Who knows? But Arthur Weasley's fury stopped them just in time. Ron would later say it was the only time he'd ever seen his dad as angry as their mum. Number 7. A joke shop. Or a hidden armory. Weasley's wizard. Wheezes became a dream come true, but it wasn't without some questionable items. Love potions? Sure. Just enough to take away someone's free will like it did with Ron, or Peruvian instant darkness powder, which Draco Malfoy later used to sneak Death Eaters into Hogwarts. A store full of laughter, or weapons in the wrong hands. Number 8. Extendable ears and breached privacy. Fred and George called them extendable ears, pale cords with little pink tips. Slip them under a door and boom, instant secrets. Before they ever sold a single pair, they tested them at home. Of course. The burrow was full of locked doors and whispered arguments. One night, voices rose downstairs, their parents, something serious. The twins lowered the ears through a crack in the ceiling and leaned in. They heard too much. Death Eaters. Disappearances. They're targeting families like ours. It wasn't a game anymore. Fred's face went pale. George didn't smile, but instead of keeping quiet, they ran to Ginny, told her every word. She froze. They're coming, she whispered. Here? That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, gripping her wand, heart racing at every sound. In the morning, Molly found her still there, eyes red, wand clenched. When she learned what happened, Molly didn't yell. That was worse. You don't share fear like candy, she said. Not with your sister. The boys stood silent. No clever comeback, no grin. The ears went in a drawer, forgotten for days. George later whispered, "We wanted to hear secrets, not spread nightmares." That time, the joke had no punchline, just a shaken sister and a lesson they wouldn't forget. Number 9. Magical fireworks and chaos in Hogwarts. Fred and George never did things halfway. Their final rebellion against Dolores Umbridge wasn't just loud, it was legendary. With a bang that shook the Great Hall, enchanted fireworks burst across the sky. Dragons roared through corridors. Catherine wheels chased students and exploded over the staircases. "You'd think they were celebrating a war," McGonagall muttered, as a flock of flaming parrots dive-bombed the arithmancy wing. It was glorious, but it wasn't safe. Seamus Finnegan got singed trying to dodge a fire serpent. A second-year Hufflepuff slipped on spilled spell slime and broke her arm. The library lost an entire shelf of ancient tomes to a rogue rocket. Even Dumbledore, though secretly amused, was forced to cast a barrier charm to contain the mayhem. "Impressive," he later said, "but utterly reckless." The twins vanished in a blaze of glory, but behind them they left bruises, smoke, and scorched stone, proof that sometimes a brilliant joke still leaves scars. Number 10, the fake fortune teller prank on Neville. They called it the Fate Teller, a golden sphere with blinking lights and a whispery voice. Fred and George claimed it could see into your future. All you had to do was place your hand on it and ask a question. "It's better than Trelawney," George joked. "At least it's entertaining." Students lined up in the common room to try it. Most got silly answers. "You will marry a troll." "You will sprout feathers." Laughter filled the air, until Neville Longbottom asked his question. He whispered it so no one could hear. The fate teller blinked, buzzed, then answered in a cold, flat voice, "You will lose everything you love." Silence fell. Neville's face drained of colour. He stood up, nodded, and walked straight to the dormitory without a word. Fred blinked. George tried to laugh, but no one joined in, not even Lee. "That wasn't funny," Hermione said sharply. Ron muttered, "That's just cruel." No one saw Neville again until dinner the next day. He barely ate, kept his eyes on the table. His herbology marks slipped that week. During class, he spilled his potion twice. "Sorry," he mumbled when Professor Sprout asked if he was all right. Luna Lovegood told him it was probably nonsense. But Neville didn't believe her. "What if it's true?" he whispered. "What if it saw Gran?" The fear in his voice was real, and for the first time Fred and George realized what they'd done. They tried to fix it. Fred dismantled the device. George said it was just coded phrases, but Neville didn't care. Trust doesn't come back with explanations. The fate teller ended up in a drawer behind their shop counter, never sold, never touched. Fred later admitted, "Some jokes don't land, some fall like bricks." That night, the twins didn't laugh. Number 11. Hermione's magically dyed hair. Hermione Granger had warned them. She caught Fred and George testing puking pastilles on terrified first-years and snapped. "They're children," she scolded, "not test subjects." Her voice rang through the corridor like a spell. The twins smirked, but didn't forget. That evening, while she worked on a restorative potion in the common room, George distracted her. Fred slipped something into her cauldron, just a drop. Bright green dye, magical, slow-acting, and resistant to any reversal charm. It kicked in the next morning. Hermione woke up, looked in the mirror, and screamed. Her hair, already impossible to manage, now blazed neon green from root to tip. No matter what charm she tried, it wouldn't go away. "Finite incantatum!" she cried again and again. Nothing. The colour pulsed like a Slytherin banner. She stormed into the great hall. The room exploded in laughter. Even some of the teachers couldn't hide their smiles, but Hermione wasn't laughing. Her eyes were glassy with fury. Ron stood up. "That's not funny," he snapped at his brothers. "She's humiliated." Fred opened his mouth to joke, but Ron's glare cut him short. Hermione sat through breakfast in silence. She didn't touch her toast. didn't look at anyone, only muttered under her breath, "This is harassment, not humour." The colour finally faded by lunchtime, but the damage stuck, not just to her hair, but to her trust. Fred and George apologised, sort of. Fred offered a free hair potion from their prototype shelf. George said, "At least you matched the Slytherin carpet." Hermione didn't even blink. She just said, "You ever touch my cauldron again and I'll charm your eyebrows off." This time she meant it. And for once, the twins didn't argue. Number 12, Lee Jordan's trapped briefcase. Lee Jordan thought he'd seen it all. Fireworks in the Great Hall, exploding toilet seats, even a self-writing essay that insulted Snape in 5 languages, but the slime briefcase, that one crossed a line. Fred and George made it for laughs, a perfect copy of Lee's bag, except when opened, it exploded with neon green sneeze slime. "Harmless fun," Fred grinned. They swapped it out before potions. Lee never noticed. Then Snape walked in, he snatched up the bag, flipped it open, and boom! A wet, violent splat. Slime shot everywhere. Snape's hair, his robes, even the ceiling dripped in thick green goo. It smelled like pepper and rotting cabbage. Students screamed. One boy dove under the desk. Snape didn't blink, just stood there, slime dripping from his nose. Then, "Everyone, out!" His voice could have cracked stone. Lee didn't even open the bag. But Snape didn't care. "Detention, a week, cauldrons." Lee tried to explain, but no one listened. Fred and George, silent. Lee scrubbed in silence for days. His robes stank, his pride worse. The twins finally came clean. "We're sorry," George said. Fred brought chocolate frogs. Lee didn't touch them. "You let me take the hit," he said. "That's not a joke, that's just cruel." For once, Fred and George had nothing to say. The slime had washed away something they didn't expect, Lee's trust. Number 13, nose-biting teacups and their misuse. Fred and George called it the quill of infinite genius. It was long, violet, and had a silver tip that shimmered suspiciously even in the dark. They claimed it could ace any exam, write perfect essays, and save you from ever lifting a finger again. When they offered it to Colin Creevey before his History of Magic test, he was thrilled. "Thanks," he squeaked, eyes wide with hope. "I really need this, I studied, but Binns always makes me blank out." The twins just smiled. "Don't worry," said Fred. "This quill knows more than Binns himself." During the exam, Colin sat with a proud grin, watching the quill scribble rapidly across the parchment without his help. But instead of facts, it wrote things like, "Helga Hufflepuff invented the moon," and "Centaur wars ended when goblins danced the tango." Some sentences didn't even use real words. McGonagall read his essay later and asked, "Mr. Creevey, what exactly is a Flibberwump diplomacy treaty?" Colin didn't know. He hadn't written a word. He got a failing grade. Worse, he was summoned to McGonagall's office, where she tried to understand if he had suffered a head injury. When he finally explained, her lips went thin. "Detention," she said, "and a letter to your parents." Colin left her office, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. He passed Fred and George in the corridor. They were laughing so hard George nearly fell over. "Best essay ever," Fred gasped, but Colin didn't look back. That was the day he stopped asking them for help. Number 14. Turning Ginny's hamster into a light show. Ginny Weasley adored animals. Her tiny hamster, Nibbles, was more than just a pet. He was her secret friend, someone she whispered to at night when the burrow was too loud or too quiet. Fred and George, of course, noticed this bond. And one rainy afternoon, boredom got the better of them. They thought it would be hilarious to improve Nibbles with a bit of experimental magic, something to make Ginny laugh. Instead, they cast a charm that made the hamster glow green, sprint across ceilings, and loudly sing a goblin marching anthem. At first, everyone stared in astonishment. Even Arthur dropped his spoon, but the moment Nibbles shrieked, "Grunthak leads, and blood will flow." In a piercing falsetto, chaos erupted. Ginny screamed. The hamster, in a wild panic, launched itself across the room, landed in the fireplace, and vanished into the Floo network. "You've killed him," Ginny sobbed. She didn't stop crying for days. George later admitted. "I think that was the first time I saw Mum look at us like we were not just troublemakers, but actual monsters." Molly Weasley was beyond furious. She slammed pots, paced the kitchen, muttering about recklessness and no sense of consequence. At one point, she shouted, "If you ever touch another living creature with your foolish spells again, I'll charm your ears into dragon tails." Fred and George for once didn't argue. They barely spoke at all for the rest of the evening. That night, they stayed in their room, not plotting their next prank, but quietly regretting the last one. The loss hit Ginny harder than they expected. She refused to come to dinner. Her brothers tried leaving notes under her door. One simply said, "We're sorry. We didn't mean for him to disappear. We just wanted him to dance." But some damage, even in the magical world, doesn't vanish with an apology. Number 15, slime in the Slytherin goblet. It was one of those rare evenings at Hogwarts when tensions between the houses seemed to momentarily dissolve. The Great Hall had been transformed into a dazzling blend of colours, with each house represented by its banners, floating candles now tinged in hues of green, blue, red, and yellow. Headmaster Dumbledore, with his usual flair for the theatrical, had declared the evening a celebration of inter-house unity. The tables were rearranged so students from different houses could mingle. Laughter echoed against the ancient walls, and the enchanted ceiling above showed not the sky, but a cascade of fireworks spelling out, "Together we stand." But beneath that shimmering canopy of goodwill, mischief was brewing. Fred and George Weasley, the notorious twins of Gryffindor, had been eyeing the Slytherin table with particular interest. The twins, as usual, couldn't resist the opportunity to add their own touch to the celebration. "Just a bit of good-natured fun," Fred whispered, nudging George as they slipped something into their robes. "Inter-house bonding, our style," George replied with a wink. What they carried was one of their latest inventions from the yet-to-be-founded Weasleys' Wizard Wheezes, a charm-infused phial filled with a thick, gelatinous substance that reacted to specific magical stimuli. It was green, sticky, and smelled faintly of mold and peppermint. Their target? A ceremonial silver goblet sitting proudly on the Slytherin table, a treasured heirloom known to most as the Slytherin cup, though it bore no relation to the ancient relic once belonging to Salazar himself. It was usually filled with elderflower wine during special events, and tonight was no exception. The twins waited until no one was looking, timed it perfectly between rounds of pumpkin pasties and honey-roasted ham, and discreetly cast a transfiguration charm. The elderflower wine vanished, replaced by a heavy, oozing green slime that bubbled ominously under the cup's lid. When the moment came, it was Millicent Bulstrode who would unknowingly spring the trap. Millicent, a fifth-year Slytherin with a reputation for being as blunt as a bludger to the face, had been in rare form that evening. Dressed in slightly less creased robes than usual, and wearing what could only be described as an attempt at a ribbon in her hair, she was trying, unsuccessfully, to make small talk with a Hufflepuff named Owen. The two were seated near the centre of the Slytherin table when Professor Flitwick chimed his glass and encouraged a toast to unity. With a deep sigh and not wanting to appear rude, Millicent stood and reached for the cup. What happened next is still whispered about in hushed voices by students who were there that night. As Millicent raised the goblet, the bottom gave way with a grotesque squelch. A torrent of thick greenish slime erupted upward, splattering across her chest, face, and the unfortunate Owen. The slime clung to everything it touched, robes, hair, even eyelashes, and had the unpleasant property of expanding upon contact with fabric. Millicent shrieked, Owen gasped, and for a moment there was silence. Then chaos. "Bloody hell, she's melting!" someone shouted, entirely misreading the situation. A first year from Ravenclaw fainted. Several students scrambled back from the Slytherin table, knocking over goblets and plates. The enchanted candles flickered wildly as spells were accidentally cast in panic. Millicent, arms raised in horror, turned in a slow, sticky circle, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. "I'm covered in it," she bellowed, What is this stuff?" George had to grip the table to keep from falling over with laughter. Fred whispered, "Best toast ever." The Slytherins, never ones to take a prank lying down, began firing off jinxes blindly. Someone sent a cloud of bat bogies across the hall, which collided with a flock of enchanted origami owls meant to symbolize peace. A particularly aggressive hex turned an entire platter of roast chicken into fluttering, squawking birds. The hall had descended into magical bedlam, and then he entered. Professor Snape, robes billowing like storm clouds, marched into the fray, wand at the ready and eyes burning with fury. "Enough!" he thundered. The hall froze. Even the slime on Millicent's robe seemed to pause mid-drip. "Who," he hissed, his voice dangerously calm, "is responsible for this travesty?" Fred and George, to their credit, remained calm. They'd long learned the art of feigned innocence. "Some sort of magical reaction, surely?" Fred said with wide eyes. "Quite unpredictable." "Could have been a faulty goblet," George offered. "Family heirlooms? You never know." Snape's gaze narrowed. "You two are about as subtle as a Hungarian horntail at a tea party." From the shadows, Professor McGonagall stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable. "Severus," she said quietly, "I believe a full inquiry is warranted, but perhaps not in front of the entire student body." Snape's nostrils flared. He turned to Millicent, who stood like a troll covered in seaweed, lips trembling with humiliation. He waved his wand with a flick, removing most of the slime, though it left behind a pungent odor and sticky sheen. "Hospital wing now," he snapped. Millicent stormed out, accompanied by a very green Owen. Fred leaned toward George. "Reckon that's the end of interhouse unity? Until next year." George grinned. Later, when questioned by Dumbledore, the twins refused to admit anything outright. "You must understand," Fred said sagely, "that sometimes joy takes unusual forms." "We were merely trying to bring a little laughter," George added, "into a house that could desperately use some." Dumbledore, ever twinkling, merely said, "And did it bring you laughter, Messrs. Weasley?" "Buckets?" they replied in unison. While no formal punishment was ever recorded, the twins found themselves scrubbing cauldrons in the potions dungeon for the next 3 weekends under Snape's ever-watchful eye. Rumour had it that he made them clean with their wands confiscated, using only enchanted scrub brushes with minds of their own. One even bit George. "It was worth it," he told Angelina later, proudly showing off the teeth marks on his wrist. The incident became known among students as the Slime Toast, and songs were composed to commemorate it. One such ballad, "Green and Mean, the Slytherin Spleen," became a minor hit in Gryffindor Tower. Even years later, students would laugh over the memory. Number 16, Fake Fan Letters to Harry. It began, as many of Fred and George's pranks did, with a hushed giggle behind closed curtains and the soft scratching of quills late into the night. The atmosphere at Hogwarts had changed after the conclusion of the Triwizard Tournament. Though Harry had returned from the graveyard alive, Cedric Diggory had not. Whispers followed Harry through corridors like shadows, rumours taking shape faster than Filch could confiscate a Zonko's product. Some called him a liar, others a hero. To Fred and George Weasley it was an opportunity. "He's moody all the time," Fred whispered, nudging George as they sat on the edge of their dormitory beds, parchment spread between them. "Reckon we could cheer him up." "Cheer him up? You mean embarrass him into oblivion?" George corrected with a grin. "I like it." Fred and George, experts in mischief and with a budding business sense, saw Harry's sudden fame as a chance for both comedy and experimentation. So they created her, Celestina Moon, a mysterious, smitten admirer, a name that sounded just believable enough to pass as real, but ridiculous enough to provoke laughter once the truth came out. The first letter arrived in the Morning Post 2 days later, nestled between Bills and Howlers. Hedwig didn't bring it. No owl Harry recognized did. It was scented with something cloying and sickly sweet, and the parchment shimmered with a faint charm. Dean Thomas found it first. "Oi, Harry!" Dean called across the Gryffindor common room, waving the envelope like it was something suspicious. "You've got a love letter." Harry blinked. "What?" Neville leaned over curiously. "Smells like lavender? Or is that lilac?" Harry snatched it away, turning pink. The handwriting was curvy and florid, with little hearts dotting the eyes. "My dearest Harry," the letter began, "I dream of your green eyes every night, twin emeralds that pierce my soul. When you stood up to that terrible Lord Thingy, I knew you were the one for me." Attached to the letter was a tiny enchanted photograph. It showed a young girl with thick black curls winking slowly, her hand brushing her cheek in a practiced swoon. There was no name, no hint as to who had sent it, only a lipstick-kissed signature, "Your Celestina." Ron choked on his pumpkin juice, laughing. "Merlin's pants, that's disgusting." Hermione rolled her eyes. "Someone's trying to wind you up." "I didn't ask for this," Harry muttered, stuffing the letter into his bag. But the letters didn't stop. Another arrived 2 days later, with a dried rose pressed between its pages and a short poem that compared Harry's bravery to the flight of hippogriffs in spring. The next came with glitter that refused to wash off for days and a lock of hair, fake, Hermione later confirmed, made of conjured thread. Then came the moment that turned the prank into humiliation. Seamus Finnegan, ever the opportunist for laughter, found one of the letters peeking from Harry's open trunk and read it aloud in the Gryffindor boys' dormitory. The letter, particularly florid, read, "When you defied the shadows, I knew my heart belonged to you. I practice kissing a pillow and pretend it's you. Don't laugh, your lips deserve practice." The room erupted. Laughter shook the bunks, Ron included, though he tried, unsuccessfully, to smother it. Harry flushed scarlet. "That's not funny." Ron raised his hands. Okay, maybe it was a bit much." "A bit?" Harry snapped. "Do you know how many people have seen these?" Fred and George, watching from the sidelines, finally cracked. Fred dropped his Celestina quill with a chuckle. "Well, it worked. You're blushing." "That wasn't the goal," Harry hissed. George offered a sheepish grin. "We only meant to take the mickey out of you, mate. Lighten things up. Didn't know it'd go public." "You put glitter in my bed, George." "It was festive glitter." Ron, now clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "You did cross a line. You know how everyone's already talking about him." Harry stormed out of the room without another word, leaving behind stunned silence and an unopened letter on his pillow. It wasn't funny anymore. For the next week, Harry didn't speak to them. He avoided the common room when they were there, skipped meals if they sat too close. Even Peeves, who normally thrived on pranks and mischief, seemed to sense that a boundary had been broken. It wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about privacy. After all that had happened in the graveyard, Voldemort's return, the pain, the fear, Harry had barely begun to process the trauma. The letters turned him into a joke. And he didn't feel like a joke. He felt haunted. Hermione, ever perceptive, pulled Fred and George aside one evening. "You think it's funny," she said bluntly, "but Harry hasn't been the same since the tournament. Those letters, those were cruel." Fred scratched the back of his neck. "We were just trying to make him smile." "Maybe try talking to him next time," Hermione said, "instead of making him the punchline." The twins looked at each other, their usual grins absent. That night, Fred slipped into the dormitory while Harry was out and left a final letter on his bed. This one wasn't perfumed or charmed. It was written in Fred's own handwriting. "Sorry, mate," it began. "Didn't mean to mess with your head. We wanted to remind you that you're still just one of us. Not a symbol, not a story. But we chose the wrong way to do it. We get it now. If you never forgive us, that's fair. Just know we're here." It wasn't much, but it was honest. A few days later, during a Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Harry muttered under his breath to Ron, "Tell them, I'm not mad anymore." Ron gave him a nod. They'll be glad to hear it. And though it took time, things slowly returned to normal. Fred and George refrained from pranking Harry again, at least not without warning. They went back to testing skiving snack boxes and inventing you-know-poo, but a subtle change remained in their approach to humour. There was more sensitivity, a hint of maturity beginning to form. Number 17, Truth Serum Incident with Professor Flitwick. It began, as most great Hogwarts stories do, with a mischievous gleam in the eyes of Fred and George Weasley. By their 5th year, the twins had long surpassed the standard mischief of dung bombs and trick wands. They had developed a taste for theatrical chaos, the kind that left professors bewildered and students in awe. That term, their latest ambition took a sharp academic turn. They wanted to make history of magic and the most notoriously boring subject at Hogwarts finally worth listening to. Professor Binns, the spectral and senile ghost who floated through lectures without noticing if half the class had fainted from boredom, had long been their favourite target of sarcasm. "He's been dead longer than this desk has been dusty," Fred once muttered, eliciting a stifled laugh from Lee Jordan. George had replied, "And that's saying something. I'm pretty sure the dust has grandchildren." Their plan was daring, outrageous, and entirely fitting for the founders of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Over Christmas break, with the help of a 5th-year Ravenclaw who owed them a favour, they managed to brew a weak but functional batch of Veritaserum. "Only a drop," the Ravenclaw had warned, "or he'll start confessing his ghostly sins in Latin." The idea was simple. Slip the truth potion into Binns' cup of classroom tea, and wait for the centuries-old professor to reveal something, anything, interesting. Perhaps tales of goblin rebellions he'd personally witnessed, or confessions of having once accidentally walked through the girls' lavatory on the 2nd floor. But there was a snag, an oversight, a fundamental flaw in magical biology. "He's dead, you idiots," Angelina Johnson said when she overheard them whispering about their plan. "Ghosts don't drink, they can't even pick things up." George raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't mean we can't try." So, with all the subtlety of a hippogriff in a broom cupboard, they slipped the potion into the steaming teacup left at the front of the class, carefully arranged next to Binns's lecture notes. Of course, the cup remained untouched. Binns floated in 10 minutes late, passed right through the desk, and began a lecture on the 1612 Goblin Uprising without so much as glancing down. "Brilliant," Fred muttered. "We just made an expensive cup of tea for the furniture." That's when fate, ever the trickster at Hogwarts, decided to intervene. The teacup was picked up, not by a ghost, but by a short, cheerful professor who had entered the room moments earlier. Professor Phileas Flitwick, head of Ravenclaw and Charms Master, had come to retrieve a misplaced quill he'd lent to Binns the week before. Mistaking the potion-laced tea for his own, after all it was sitting right on the desk with a familiar, charm-etched mug, he gave a cheery sip. "Ah, thank you," Flitwick murmured absently, then paused. A strange look came over him, like the flutter of confusion that precedes a sneeze. Fred nudged George. "Did you see that?" What followed was a lesson none of the students would ever forget. Flitwick, brilliant, kind, and usually composed, began talking. At first, it seemed like he was simply engaging with the class, commenting on the dusty windows and the oddly cold temperature of the classroom. Then his tone shifted. "Sometimes," he said, with a wistful look at the far wall, "I wonder what life might have been like if I'd taken that post in Vienna. The Academy of Magical Performance offered me a position, you know, right after the war, but Hogwarts is home." A few students exchanged puzzled looks. Binns hadn't noticed a thing. He was still muttering about treaties and wand licenses. Then came the moment that truly stunned the room. Flitwick stood still, almost trembling, and murmured, "I once loved someone here, deeply, but she never knew, or perhaps she knew, and chose to ignore it. We still see each other in the staff lounge, and every time my heart curls into itself." Fred's eyes widened. "This is better than that time Lockhart hexed his own hair off." George whispered, "Who do you think it is?" No one dared interrupt. It was as if Flitwick was under a spell. He turned slightly, gripping the edge of the desk as if bracing himself. "I'm afraid of mice," he confessed suddenly. Utterly terrified, I once levitated a teacup at a family gathering when I saw one scurry by. The cup hit my uncle in the face. He never spoke to me again. A roar of laughter exploded through the room. Even Binns paused for a moment, looking around vaguely, before returning to his speech on Gringotts regulations. But the laughter was mixed with something else, an awkwardness, a shared sense that they were witnessing something they weren't meant to hear. When Flitwick realized what had happened, that he had just spilled his soul in front of an entire class, his face went scarlet. He stammered an excuse, mumbled something about needing fresh air, and hurried out of the classroom. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a stunned silence. "Blimey," said Ron Weasley finally. "That was... wow." Hermione looked deeply uncomfortable. "That was Veritaserum? It had to be. That's not like Professor Flitwick at all." Harry frowned. "But who—" Fred and George shrunk lower in their seats. Later that evening, word of the event had spread through the entire castle. Even the portraits seemed to be whispering about it. Sir Cadogan in particular was deeply moved. "Unspoken love, a tale as old as time, my brave companions." Professor McGonagall was not amused. "Who brewed it?" she demanded in the staff room the next day. "This is no longer mischief. This could cost someone their position." No one came forward. Fred and George, faced with the very real possibility of expulsion or worse, kept silent. It was only when Professor Flitwick himself asked for the matter to be dropped. "No harm was truly done," he said kindly, that the storm began to pass. Still, the damage had been done in ways none of them could have predicted. Number 18, Gnome snot shoes and public embarrassment. It started with a cough, then a sniffle, then a shrill, unmistakable whistle that echoed through the great hall and silenced every murmur. Crispin Dunstan, a plump and usually quiet third-year Hufflepuff, had been preparing for his speech for weeks. It was a proud moment. He had been selected to give the opening remarks at the annual House Unity Assembly, a ceremony meant to inspire camaraderie between the four houses. Professor Sprout herself had written him a congratulatory note. "You have such a kind heart, Crispin. Let it shine through your words." And yet, as he rose from his seat and adjusted the school-issue yellow and black tie with trembling fingers, something very wrong began to happen. His nose started to run, not subtly, but violently. Thick, bright green mucus dripped past his upper lip, and with every panicked gasp for breath, a loud rang through the enchanted ceiling of the great hall. He clutched the edge of the podium in horror. A second sniff, another shriek, this time so high-pitched that a first-year Ravenclaw dropped her goblet in fright. The hall dissolved into whispers, then snickers, and then outright laughter. Some students clutched their stomachs in hilarity. Others looked alarmed. Professor Flitwick dropped his wand. Fred and George Weasley, seated casually at the Gryffindor table with matching grins, gave each other a high five under the table. George bit his lip to stifle a laugh. Fred whispered, "Perfect execution, bloody perfect." The confection responsible was their latest experimental treat. Gnome chew, Snowballs, or as the twins affectionately referred to them, gnomish chewy snot. According to George's prototype notes, scribbled hastily on the back of a borrowed Charms essay, the idea was to simulate the snot-exploding, squeaky breathing of garden gnomes when caught by surprise. The effect was achieved by mixing powdered doxy wings, an extract from enchanted jellyfish for the texture, and a proprietary spell that Fred refused to disclose even to Angelina Johnson. The twins had tested the treat on a frog first. It had croaked like a banshee for a full minute before dissolving into a puddle of goo. Encouraged by this result, they lured Crispin Dunstan with the offer of a new, sugar-free fudge. "Revolutionary," Fred had claimed, "perfect for your nerves before a big speech." "Cheers," Crispin had said innocently, popping the pale green cube into his mouth. At that moment in the great hall, As the crowd erupted in disbelief, Professor McGonagall stood with both palms pressed to her forehead. "For Merlin's sake," she muttered, her Scottish lilt thick with exasperation. Crispin, now utterly mortified, ran from the stage, honking and squealing with every step. His tie flapped wildly behind him, leaving a slimy trail of magical mucus across the floor. The Weasley twins were summoned immediately to Dumbledore's office. In that office, Dumbledore sat in his throne-like chair, fingers steepled beneath his long silver beard. "Boys," he said with a raised eyebrow, "might I inquire into the origins of Mr. Dunstan's unexpected vocal performance?" Fred shifted. "It was an experiment in magical confectionery, sir," he admitted. George nodded. "All in good humour." Dumbledore sighed. "The poor child hasn't left the Hufflepuff dormitory since. Madame Pomfrey says the squealing will wear off in 3 days, but he's understandably embarrassed." Fred raised a tentative hand. "But did it work, sir? Technically?" "To great effect," Dumbledore said with a ghost of a smile. "But Hogwarts is not a test market. You will refrain from using your fellow students as unknowing participants in your innovations. Understood?" They nodded. "Yes, Professor." It was not their first warning, nor their last, but gnomish chewy snot earned its place in the underground catalogue of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, becoming an infamous legend among students long before their shop in Diagon Alley ever opened. Years later, when Harry Potter himself found the twins' joke shop packed wall-to-wall with enchantments and explosions, he noticed a tin of emerald green chews on the back shelf. The label read, "Gnome Snotballs for nasal mayhem and musical wheezing, not for public speeches." Harry blinked. "Didn't Crispin Dunstan eat one of these?" George, manning the counter, grinned. "We never confirmed nor denied that story." Fred appeared behind him, holding a box of fainting fancies. "Let's just say he taught us the importance of dosage. That batch was enthusiastic." "You had him screaming like a cauldron full of pixies," Harry said with a laugh. "He squealed with such artistry," George added. "Truly a performance for the ages." Ron, who had just come in with Hermione, snorted. "You two are lucky McGonagall didn't feed you to the Whomping Willow." "She did threaten to," Fred winked. But then Dumbledore called it innovative magical application. That man knew the value of a good prank. The incident remained one of the most dramatic sabotage stories in Hogwarts history. Even Lee Jordan, who had seen his share of chaos, later described it in his book Behind the Laughs, Hogwarts Pranks and Pranksters as a masterpiece in comedic sabotage, horrifyingly brilliant. But the aftermath wasn't all snorts and snickers. Crispin Dunstan, after recovering from the humiliation, developed a mild phobia of sweets. He transferred to the herbology department as an assistant under Professor Sprout and swore off public speaking entirely. In a rare interview with the Daily Prophet 10 years later, Crispin recounted the day with a nervous laugh. "I thought I'd caught dragon flu. Then I realized I was screaming through my nostrils. People think it's funny now, but it was intense." He paused, looking at the camera with a lopsided smile. "Still, it taught me resilience, and Fred and George sent me free sweets for life after that. None of them squeal, probably." Back at Hogwarts, the tale became a cautionary legend. First years whispered about the Hufflepuff boy who honked. Prefects warned against accepting candy from anyone with red hair and a mischievous glint in their eye. The Weasley twins, for all their chaos, had an instinct for the theatrical. Their jokes weren't just pranks, they were performances. "We aim for memories," George once said, "the kind you never forget." Even as adults, they reminisced about the snotball incident with pride. At one point, George toyed with the idea of releasing a limited edition Screaming Crispin Chew, but scrapped the idea out of respect. "We owe him more than that," he told a curious reporter. "Without Crispin, we might never have learned restraint." As for the candy itself, Gnome Chew snotballs were eventually discontinued, not because of safety concerns, but because they were simply too effective. "No one wants to relive that level of nasal drama," Angelina Johnson said flatly. "Once is enough." Yet among pranksters, the treat gained cult status. A rare tin sold at a collector's auction for 70 galleons. The buyer, a grinning witch with bright pink hair and a penchant for trouble, called it a piece of Hogwarts history. And in the farthest corner of the Wheezes' archive room, where failed experiments and near catastrophes are boxed and labelled, there lies a small glass jar, inside one preserved gnome chew snotball, still shimmering green. A handwritten tag reads, "For emergency use only, may induce shrieking, use with caution." In the end, perhaps the story of the squealing speech was more than just a joke. It was a turning point, a lesson in limits, a demonstration that even laughter has consequences, and maybe, just maybe, a strange kind of tribute to a quiet Hufflepuff who, for one unforgettable moment, had the entire school listening, even if it was through his nose. Number 19, turning Ernie McMillan into a partial walrus. It happened during Ernie McMillan's 5th year at Hogwarts, and though many students would later recall the incident with laughter, for Ernie it would be a week of humiliation, silence, and unexpected reflection. The prank, like so many others orchestrated by Fred and George Weasley, began with laughter in mind, but ended with a rare intervention from none other than Albus Dumbledore himself. Fred and George were in their usual spot in the Gryffindor common room, huddled over a stack of parchment that smelled faintly of singed wool. "We've done canary creams, nosebleed nougat, and even that delightful tongue-lengthening taffy," Fred said, twirling his wand between his fingers. "But what if we tried something a little transformative?" George leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Transfiguration meets practical joke. I like it." And so the idea was born, a quick, seemingly harmless transformation charm. Something reversible, comical, and, most importantly, public. They needed a subject, someone who wouldn't see it coming. Ernie McMillan, a proud and often pompous Hufflepuff prefect, had been lecturing a group of third years about the proper way to polish a cauldron only the day before. His voice carried across the corridor like a trumpet, and his posture was that of someone convinced he was meant for far greater things than an ordinary Hogwarts education. "He practically begs for it," George whispered. "The walrus thing you were talking about. Short tusks, a moustache, maybe a bulgy nose." Fred laughed. "Throw in some blubber around the cheeks and you've got Ernie the sea beast." The charm was tricky. It wasn't in the standard textbooks, but rather in a dusty tome George had borrowed from the restricted section. The spell, Transmuto Rictus Seelie, was meant for advanced transfiguration practice, a temporary change of facial features more suited for fourth-year theory than practical use. The book warned, avoid use on unwilling subjects, as psychological backlash may occur. But to Fred and George, the caution read more like an invitation than a deterrent. The morning of the prank, they waited just outside the Hufflepuff entrance, casually tossing a dung bomb back and forth. Ernie emerged in his neatly pressed uniform, hair parted to the side, humming something that sounded like a hymn to personal responsibility. As he rounded the corner, Fred made a distracted comment about Ernie's tie being crooked. "Let me fix that," Fred offered cheerfully. As Ernie leaned in, George, standing behind, whispered the incantation and tapped the back of Ernie's head with his wand. The transformation was instant. Ernie didn't feel it right away. He blinked, adjusted his robe, and continued walking. But as he passed a group of second years, a ripple of giggles began to spread, then a full laugh, and another. By the time he reached the great hall, the laughter had become a wave, echoing against the enchanted ceiling. "What's going on?" Ernie muttered, trying to ignore the stares. It wasn't until he saw himself reflected in the polished silver pitcher on the Gryffindor table that he understood. His upper lip bristled with stiff, bristly whiskers. His nostrils flared over a rounded, drooping nose. Two short, yellowing tusks jutted awkwardly from his bottom lip, and his cheeks bulged outward with a doughy softness. His eyes, still his own, blinked in horror. He screamed. But instead of silence, the hall erupted in laughter, not the stifled giggles of first years, but deep, uncontrollable howls from every table. Even some of the professors tried, and failed, to conceal their smiles. Ron Weasley nearly choked on a sausage. "Blimey! What happened to Ernie? Hermione gave Fred and George a stern look. "You didn't." George raised his hands innocently. "What? A little magical mischief never hurt anyone." "Looks more like magical bullying," Hermione snapped. Ernie fled the hall, his robes flapping behind him like a torn sail. He ran past portraits who gasped in dismay, past Peeves who cackled, "Wobble, wobble, walrus boy," and even past Professor McGonagall, who nearly dropped her stack of essays when she caught sight of him. He locked himself in a second-floor bathroom and didn't come out for hours, not even when Hannah Abbott knocked softly and whispered that Madame Pomfrey could fix it. Fred and George expected the charm to wear off within the hour, but it didn't. 2 hours passed, then 3. When Ernie finally emerged near sunset, he looked the same. By the next morning, the fun had curdled into concern. "I thought it was temporary," Fred muttered. "It was supposed to be temporary. Maybe he has a weird immune system," George offered. "Or maybe he's holding on to it emotionally." Dumbledore summoned them both that evening. They found him in his office, staring pensively into the dancing light of the pensive. "Boys," he said without looking up, "I must admit I've always admired your creativity. But when creativity causes humiliation, it ceases to be clever. It becomes cruelty." "We didn't mean to hurt him, Professor," George said, his voice lower than usual. Fred nodded. "It was just a prank." Dumbledore finally turned. His eyes, always twinkling, now held only weariness. "You may not have meant to hurt him, but you did. Ernie McMillan has refused to attend class. He refuses meals, and most concerningly, he refuses to speak." There was a long silence. The clock behind Dumbledore's desk ticked steadily. Fawkes shifted on his perch. "I believe magic," Dumbledore continued, "is a tool to elevate our minds and deepen our compassion. When it is used for farce, it loses its nobility." He handed them a page, torn from the very book they had used. Below the incantation, Dumbledore had underlined a line in red ink. "Undoing the spell requires apology, recognition of harm, and voluntary release by the victim." "We have to apologize?" Fred asked, stunned. George looked at the page. "You mean, like, really apologize?" "Unless, of course," Dumbledore said with a flick of a smile, "you would prefer him to remain a walrus indefinitely." That night, they stood outside the Hufflepuff dormitory, holding a plate of chocolate frogs and a folded note that read, "Sorry for the tusks, and the whiskers, and the nose, especially the nose." Ernie didn't answer. They tried again the next morning, and the evening after that. On the third attempt, they found him sitting near the greenhouse, reading a herbology textbook through his bulging, watery eyes. Fred cleared his throat. "We messed up." Ernie said nothing. George sat down beside him. "Look, we've pranked loads of people. Snape, Filch, Percy. We even gave Ron a tail once, but we always laugh about it afterward. That's what makes it okay." "But I'm not laughing," Ernie said quietly. They both paused. The weight of the statement settled over them like a cloak. "I walked through the castle," Ernie continued, "with people pointing, laughing. I was a joke, a thing. I value dignity, and you took that from me." Fred nodded. "You're right. We didn't think." George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "It's something we're working on, a reversal charm. We figured if you didn't want to undo it through the usual way, we could make it easier." Ernie studied the box, then them. After a long pause, he took it. The moment he opened it, a soft golden mist escaped and enveloped him. Within seconds, the tusks shrank, the nose receded, the whiskers vanished. He was Ernie again, but he didn't smile. "I'll forgive you," he said, "but I won't forget." And with that, he stood and walked away, leaving Fred and George staring after him. The story of Ernie the Walrus became legend. It was whispered about in the corridors, exaggerated in the common rooms, and eventually retold by students who hadn't even been there. Some said he grew flippers. Others claimed Dumbledore threatened to expel the twins. None of it was true. What was true, what remained undeniable, was the moment when laughter turned into cruelty. when the joke stopped being funny. And when even the greatest pranksters at Hogwarts were forced to confront the cost of their magic, George would later say, "That was the prank that taught us respect." Fred added, "And how not to mess with Hufflepuffs, they're tougher than they look." In the years that followed, Ernie rarely mentioned the incident, but in his final year, when asked by a first year what advice he would give, he paused and said, "Remember that dignity is a delicate thing, easy to shatter, hard to rebuild." And somewhere in the castle, a portrait of a walrus, painted in jest, hung in secret, remained hidden behind a tapestry, a quiet reminder that even magic has its limits. Number 20, the fake Ministry of Magic letter to Percy. It happened during one of those rare moments when the entire Weasley family was gathered under one roof. The burrow, warm and chaotic as ever, alive with clinking dishes, rising steam, and the rustle of magical cutlery trying to escape Ginny's cleaning charms. Molly Weasley, apron on, wand behind her ear, was humming as she prepared lamb stew for dinner, while Arthur raved about his latest discovery in the misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, a toaster that could play the national anthem. Bill and Charlie were in the garden, debating whether Norbert, the Norwegian ridgeback Hagrid once raised, had been male or female all along. Ron and Harry were playing wizard chess on the floor, Hermione reading nearby, occasionally glancing up to criticize one of Ron's impulsive moves. The twins, Fred and George, however, were nowhere in sight. Only Percy sat rigidly at the far end of the table, a thick sheaf of ministry parchment beside his untouched plate. He wore his new deep green ministry robes with all the dignity of someone recently knighted. Glasses perched on his nose, he cleared his throat in that pompous manner that made even the ghoul in the attic groan. "I'll have to leave early today," he announced. "I've just received an owl from the Department of International Magical Cooperation. It's regarding the annual conference on cauldron thickness standards." Fred and George, who had just slunk back into the room with identical mischievous smirks, exchanged a glance, so loaded with wicked glee that even Crookshanks raised an eyebrow. The letter in Percy's hand was folded with extreme precision. The seal looked official, the handwriting confident and sharp, and at the bottom was a nearly perfect replica of the minister's signature. "Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic." Percy held it as if it was sacred parchment. "Percy, dear, it's Sunday," Molly reminded him, dishing mashed potatoes onto his plate. "This is urgent ministry business, Mother," he sniffed. "The minister wouldn't have summoned me personally if it weren't a matter of grave importance." Fred gave an exaggerated cough. "Yes, grave. Like a grave mistake, perhaps," George chimed in, "or perhaps a grave joke. But Percy, either too self-absorbed or too eager to impress, didn't catch the hint. He pushed back his chair, gathered his scrolls, and with one final fussy sweep of his robes, disapparated with a sharp crack. Silence followed. Then the twins collapsed into their chairs, gasping with laughter. "You really sent it?" Ron asked, gaping. Fred, tears already forming in his eyes, nodded. "Wrote it myself, using that enchanted quill we snuck from Zonko's." George leaned across the table, barely able to contain himself. "We even transfigured our old prefect badge into an official-looking seal. It stuck right to the parchment." Percy didn't even question it. Hermione looked scandalized. "You impersonated the Minister of Magic?" "Only in writing," Fred shrugged. "And really, if Percy believes the minister would interrupt Sunday roast to discuss cauldron thickness, he deserves what he gets." Meanwhile, Percy arrived at the Ministry of Magic in record time, robes flapping, heart pounding with anticipation. He had envisioned himself in the minister's office, perhaps sipping tea with Cornelius Fudge himself, being thanked personally for his tireless dedication to the department. Maybe even a promotion, or at least a mention in the Daily Prophet. But when he reached level 1, the hallway was deserted, not even the usual memos flying through the air. The great mahogany door to the minister's office was firmly closed. On it was a note, written in an unmistakably mocking script. "You're late, Mr. Genius." Percy stared. His hands trembled. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. Perhaps he had the wrong floor. Perhaps the meeting had moved. But when he looked closer, the parchment bore no seal. No ministry watermark, just the twins' unmistakable handwriting. He could tell now that he looked properly. That damned curling Y in Mr. Genius. Fred always looped it like that. He turned on the spot, livid. When he apparated back to the burrow, the dinner table was still full. The family erupted into startled silence as he stormed into the kitchen, his face the colour of dragon's blood. "Who did this?" he thundered, brandishing the parchment like it was a cursed object. Fred and George instantly disappeared under the table, but their giggles gave them away. Molly rose alarmed. "Percy, what happened? This letter is a joke!" he bellowed. "A fake! I left our family gathering. I apparated to London on a Sunday because of a prank." He looked ready to breathe fire. Even the gnome in the corner dove for cover. "I have never," he continued, shaking, "been so humiliated in all my life." George peeked over the edge of the table. "Oh, come now! Surely the time you spilled ink all over Bartemius Crouch's slippers was worse." "Or," Fred added, joining him, "that time your quill leaked and turned your hair purple." "Enough!" Percy shouted, his face now beyond red, approaching Weasley roof orange. Molly moved between them like a lioness guarding her cub. "Fred, George, upstairs. Now!" "But Mum," Fred tried. "Now!" The twins slunk up the stairs, their laughter quickly fading as they realized just how furious Percy was. The entire family sat in silence. Percy stood at the head of the table, breathing hard, fists clenched. Even Ron didn't dare move a piece on the chessboard. "You have no idea what this could mean for my career," Percy said, voice tight. "If anyone from the ministry had seen me, if word of this prank gets out—" Arthur, calm as ever, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Percy, I think it's time to remember you're still a brother as well as an employee of the ministry." But Percy didn't answer. He stormed out of the kitchen, the fake letter crushed in his hand, and locked himself in his room for the rest of the evening. Later that night, Fred whispered through the crack in Percy's door. "Come on, Perce. It was funny. Admit it. Go away," came the cold response. All right, George muttered. "We'll make it up to you. We'll enchant your robes to sparkle at the next staff meeting." "George! Kidding! We're kidding!" The door remained firmly shut. It wasn't until the next morning, over breakfast, that Percy finally emerged, pale and stiff-backed. He didn't say a word, but he did shoot Fred and George a look that could have melted steel. They returned it with sheepish grins. Years later, when the Weasley twins opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, that letter hung in a gilded frame behind the register. The original parchment, slightly crumpled, still bore the note, "You're late, Mr. Genius." Below it, in gold calligraphy, were the words, "The prank that nearly destroyed the family dinner, but made ministry history." It became one of the most asked-about artifacts in the shop. Customers from Diagon Alley to Hogsmeade would stop and laugh, asking, "Did Percy really fall for it?" Fred would always reply with a grin, "Fell harder than a troll on roller skates." Even Percy, years later, when visiting with his own children, would shake his head with a half-smile. "I still haven't forgiven them, you know." And George, looking at the frame, would answer, "You don't have to, Perce, but you have to admit it was brilliant." And perhaps it was, because beyond the embarrassment, the shouting, the slamming of doors, and the outrage, it was pure, unfiltered Weasley. A family that teased hard but loved even harder. A family where pranks were sometimes cruel, but never cruel-hearted. Even in the books we hear Percy's indignation at his brothers more than once. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Molly remarks, "Percy is very ambitious, you know. It's all very well for Fred and George, but he's always wanted to be someone important at the ministry." And that desire, that drive, made him the perfect target for his twin brothers, who had long mastered the art of pin-pricking pompous egos with just the right dose of humour. Was it kind? Perhaps not. But was it effective? Absolutely. Because no matter how high Percy climbed the ministry ladder, no matter how many memos he wrote or cauldrons he regulated, he would always remember that one Sunday when the minister didn't call and the note read, "You're late, Mr. Genius." And in the echo of Fred and George's laughter that followed, somewhere in that sound was the beating heart of the Weasley family. Number 21. Screaming enchanted buttons. It all began on a wind-blown Tuesday morning when the air at Hogwarts had that rare crispness which made every student's robes flutter just a little more proudly. Fred and George Weasley, seated together in the back row of the Charms classroom, were whispering furiously over something small, metallic, and gleaming. Their faces wore the unmistakable sheen of excitement, that reckless glint in the eye they both shared whenever a new idea began to take form, the kind of idea that would soon be followed by a detention or a legendary story whispered in corridors. Earlier that week, the twins had been experimenting with a new line of magical pranks under the banner of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. This new concept was simple in theory, devilishly complex in execution, attachable spells, enchantments that could bind themselves to common items and be activated by touch, movement, or sound. The prototype was crude, a set of charm-infused buttons designed to react whenever pressed. The testing phase, as always, required a guinea pig. Enter Neville Longbottom. Neville had always been an easy target, not because he lacked courage or on the contrary, he had it in spades, but because he possessed the kind of innocent trustfulness that made him believe, even after all he had endured, that perhaps this time the Weasley twins really did just want to help him patch up his school robes. They approached him outside the greenhouse. "Neville," Fred had said with that smooth, honeyed tone that usually preceded disaster, "you've got a button loose on your sleeve. Allow us." What followed was a blur of wand movements, muttered incantations, and Neville's own look of helplessness as his sleeve was taken over by the pair. By the end of it, 6 new buttons had been sewn onto Neville's robe, each ordinary in appearance, but pulsing faintly with magic. The first button revealed its secret in the corridor leading to transfiguration. Neville, trying to secure his robe against a gust of wind, pressed it casually, and from somewhere near his chest, a loud and unmistakable pig's grunt echoed down the hallway. Heads turned. A 5th-year Ravenclaw dropped her books. Peeves materialized from a wall, clapping mid-air. Neville turned bright red, trying to fumble with the cloth, but every attempt to adjust his robes only triggered a new wave of sounds. A wet squelch, a distant cannon blast, the high-pitched wail of a banshee. By lunchtime, Neville was drawing looks wherever he walked. He sat quietly at the Gryffindor table, trying not to move a muscle. Unfortunately, Seamus Finnegan had the misfortune of tapping Neville on the back to ask for a spoon, which led to a sound so eerily like moaning Myrtle crying in the girls' lavatory that several students stopped eating entirely. But the climax of the magical button debacle occurred during Professor Umbridge's notoriously strict defense against the dark arts class. Neville was trying very hard to remain perfectly still. His arms were stiff at his sides. He was barely breathing. Around him, the class was engaged in a silent reading task, an assignment meant to occupy their minds while Umbridge sipped tea, her beady eyes scanning for disobedience. It happened so quickly no one could have predicted it. A quill rolled off the desk of lavender brown. It landed near Neville's foot. In a moment of innocent instinct, Neville bent slightly to pick it up. His palm pressed into the 3rd button. There was a moment's silence. Then, from deep within the folds of Neville's cloak, in a tone shrill and unmistakably authoritarian, came the voice of Professor Dolores Umbridge herself. "Silence, Mr. Longbottom." The room froze. The real Umbridge, midway through sipping her tea, turned the colour of salmon and nearly dropped her cup. Her eyes bulged. She looked around wildly, unsure whether she had spoken aloud or lost her mind. Parvati Patil began giggling. Dean Thomas let out a snort he quickly disguised as a cough. The silence broke like shattering glass as the entire classroom exploded into laughter. Neville, panicking, tried to cover the sound by crossing his arms, but this only triggered the remaining buttons. A rapid-fire symphony of sounds followed. One moaned like a dying mandrake, another mimicked the deep gurgle of someone drinking polyjuice potion incorrectly. The final button, located near his collar, emitted a deep growl, like the Hungarian horntail Harry had faced during the Triwizard Tournament. "Enough!" Umbridge shrieked, voice high and cracked. Her hand slammed the table. "Detention, for all of you, and especially you, Longbottom," Neville tried to explain. His voice cracked. "It wasn't me, it was—" But his explanation was drowned out by the re-triggering of the Banshee button, which wailed again in an unholy pitch. Neville was dragged to the front of the class by Filch himself and forced to stand, arms raised, while Umbridge attempted to locate and silence the rogue enchantments. Unfortunately, the buttons were clever. Fred and George had not only infused them with sound spells, but had also laced them with simple mobility charms, making them slide just out of reach when touched. It took 3 professors and nearly half an hour to remove them completely. McGonagall was brought in, and upon seeing the nature of the prank, could barely suppress the twitch of a smile. "While I do not condone this behaviour," she said dryly, "it is admittedly quite innovative." The buttons were eventually removed manually with a severing charm, one by one, and sealed inside a glass case in Flitwick's office for further study. Fred and George were not punished, not officially. They denied everything with such flamboyant innocence that even Dumbledore, when informed of the incident, is rumoured to have chuckled and said, "Boys will be boys." But for Neville, the damage had already been done. Though the enchantments were gone, the fear remained. For weeks afterward, he refused to wear robes with buttons, opting instead for pullovers and jumpers, even in classes. When asked why, he would mutter something vague about button trauma and change the subject. He even wrote home to his gran, requesting that she please not send anything stitched from now on. Some say that night in the Gryffindor common room, Fred approached Neville with a solemn expression and offered him a gift, a small tin of decibel dowsing draught, to use in case of any further sonic disturbances. Neville accepted it, though he never used it. The tin remained unopened in his bedside drawer for the rest of the year, a quiet reminder of the day his clothing turned against him. Others remember the incident more fondly. It was retold over and over, especially during breakfast conversations and late-night gatherings in the common rooms. Even the portraits on the grand staircase took up the tale, with the fat lady occasionally quoting Umbridge's recorded voice in a mock haughty tone, causing first years to jump. Years later, when the twins opened their full-fledged joke shop in Diagon Alley, they released a commercial version of the same prank, marketing it as Talking Threads TM. The product came with a warning label, "Use responsibly, not for use in classes with humorless toads." Customers could choose from a range of sounds: doxies buzzing, snapes sighing in disappointment, house elves crying, and even exclusive quotes like, "Not another misstep, Potter," in McGonagall's clipped brogue. The product was a bestseller within weeks. Even Lee Jordan was seen wearing a vest with murmuring lapels, which whispered gossip depending on who passed by. Neville, however, never bought one. When asked about the incident during an interview for the Daily Prophet years later, he laughed. "Those 2 nearly gave me a heart attack," he said. "But if it weren't for them, I might never have developed such thick skin, or learned silencing charms for that matter." That single day, that classroom moment, became a minor Hogwarts legend. It joined the ranks of the enchanted snowball that pelted Quirrell's turban, the floating pudding of Aunt Petunia, and the great swamp Fred and George left behind during their infamous departure. In the great tapestry of magical mischief, the talking buttons earned their own square. And perhaps, in that peculiar and chaotic spirit that always defined life at Hogwarts, this story remains one of the purest examples of how magic could be whimsical, troublesome, hilarious, and heartwarming, all at once. Number 22, The Stair Trap for Dean Thomas. It was the second week of the new term at Hogwarts, and the Gryffindor common room was unusually noisy for a Monday afternoon. Students carried bags of sweets from Hogsmeade, parchment rolls under their arms, and broomsticks over their shoulders. Above them, the twisting ancient staircases groaned and clicked as they adjusted, shifting mid-air like great wooden snakes with a mind of their own. Amidst the cheerful chaos, few paid attention to a quietly sweating Dean Thomas, who was attempting the near impossible, dragging a massive overstuffed trunk up the spiralling staircase to the boys' dormitories on the 3rd floor of Gryffindor Tower. Dean had returned a day late from his holidays after a delay involving his mother, a confused owl, and the sudden disappearance of his train ticket. By the time he reached Hogwarts, classes had already resumed, and he was behind on transfiguration notes. He carried guilt in his shoulders, which hunched further under the weight of his trunk. What he didn't know, what no one had thought to warn him about, was that Fred and George Weasley, in one of their less destructive but equally exasperating moods, had cast a complex charm over the stairwell. For the past 3 days, every 10th step on that staircase had been enchanted to act as a loop. As soon as someone stepped on it, they would be sent tumbling back to the bottom. No pain, no injuries, just relentless and humiliating repetition. The Weasley twins, long hailed as geniuses of mischief, had been testing this particular spell for weeks. "It's for research," Fred had muttered as he tapped his wand rhythmically against the step in question. George had scribbled something in a small notebook filled with half-brewed joke shop ideas. "Every 10th, that way no one will suspect until it's too late." Just imagine the drama. The charm was clever. It didn't activate with a simple step. It waited until someone was carrying something heavy or distracted. Their hope, their ultimate dream, was to catch someone like Percy in full prefect regalia, books piled high, dignity even higher. But fate offered them something better. Dean Thomas was not a particularly loud or flamboyant student. He enjoyed football, muggle art, and sitting quietly in the corner of the common room with his sketchbook. His best friends, Seamus and Neville, had already carried their things up days ago. He was alone, quietly muttering encouragement to himself as he tackled the last staircase. Just 10 more steps, he thought. Just 10. With one heave, he grunted and stepped forward, only to find himself back on the ground floor again, the trunk thudding beside him. At first he blinked, confused. Did I lose count? He wondered. He counted again. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. Then again, slam, back down. The charm had no dramatic flash, no obvious trigger. It worked silently and invisibly, folding space in a subtle, magical loop. Again and again, Dean found himself at the bottom, growing sweatier, redder, and more frustrated. Around the 20th try, he dropped his trunk entirely and sat on the floor, panting, staring up at the steps, like they had personally betrayed him. Fred and George were in the corner of the common room, half-shielded behind an armchair, watching with wicked delight. George had started timing Dean with a silver pocket watch, while Fred munched on a chocolate frog. They didn't laugh loudly. No, they savoured the spectacle in silence, eyes gleaming. "This is better than we imagined," George whispered, scribbling in the notebook again. "We should sell this as a product, loopsteps RTTM, for parties." Dean, meanwhile, had abandoned all hope of carrying the trunk as a whole. He knelt, groaning, and began unpacking it, item by item, a pair of trainers, a folded Chudley Cannons poster, a small stack of notebooks. It was humiliating. No one else had noticed, thankfully. Most were outdoors or in the library. But the steps had beaten him. 43 minutes. That's how long it took for him to stop trying. The trunk had been packed with loving chaos. Dean's mum had insisted he bring enough jumpers in case the castle got cold, despite Hogwarts being warm year-round. There was a small collection of Muggle comic books hidden beneath robes and an entire set of sketching pencils sealed in a plastic case. Each trip up the stairs was like a memory peeled open. On his 4th trip, Dean paused, holding a small envelope. It was from his sister. "Don't forget who you are, big bro," it read in loopy handwriting. He sighed, pocketed the note, and trudged upward again. McGonagall arrived exactly 44 minutes in. She didn't stomp, she didn't shout. She simply walked into the common room, a stack of essays floating beside her, and noticed 2 things at once. Dean Thomas in a state of personal disarray, knees wobbling, arms full of socks, and the unmistakable glint of Fred and George's guilt. Professor McGonagall had taught at Hogwarts long enough to detect Weasley brand nonsense from a single sigh. She turned to Fred and George, her mouth a thin line. Fred smiled innocently. George tried to hide the notebook under a cushion. "Mr. Weasley," she said, in a voice like frozen iron. "Mr. Weasley, would you care to explain why Mr. Thomas appears trapped in a Sisyphean loop at the foot of your dormitory staircase?" Fred blinked. What loop, Professor?" She didn't answer. Instead, with a flick of her wand, she cancelled the charm instantly. The staircase shimmered with pale blue light, and the 10th step gave a faint squeal like a caught mouse. Dean, midway up with an armful of ties, suddenly found the path smooth. He didn't thank her, he simply nodded, exhausted, and continued his climb. "Your wands," she said simply. "Now." The confiscation lasted only 24 hours, but it was a dark age for the twins. For them, their wands were more than tools, they were lifelines, artistic instruments of chaos and invention. Without them, Fred and George wandered the corridors like ghosts, unable to finish even a simple prank. "We've been muzzled," Fred told Lee Jordan dramatically. "This is oppression." Dean recovered quickly. By the next day, he was laughing with Seamus over toast, exaggerating the story of the staircase until it became myth. "I nearly starved," he said, "was about to start eating my own socks." What the twins hadn't anticipated was how the incident elevated Dean in the eyes of the Gryffindor younger years. To survive the Weasley trap was no small feat. He became something of a quiet legend. Stoic, determined, the boy who braved the eternal staircase. One first year even asked for his autograph, convinced the entire ordeal was a planned magical test. Fred and George were later overheard muttering about their failure to prank Percy, and how Dean's resilience had somehow turned their joke into a badge of honor. "We've accidentally made him heroic," George groaned. "We need to recalibrate." The spell itself was noted by Professor Flitwick during a later class. "An excellent use of localized time loop charms," he said, glancing over a parchment essay one of the twins had submitted, "but deeply irresponsible when applied to school infrastructure." That didn't stop them, of course. Within weeks, they had invented a charm that made certain doors whisper gossip about whoever passed through, but the staircase trap remained a legend, passed down for years. It became part of Gryffindor lore, retold with laughter and admiration. Did you know, someone would whisper, Dean Thomas once fought gravity and won? Years later, after Hogwarts had changed in ways no one expected and the twins' prank shop became the stuff of legend, the staircase story resurfaced during an alumni event. Angelina Johnson, now a Quidditch coach, laughed so hard she spilled butterbeer on her robes. Dean, older now, more self-assured, smiled modestly. "Still the most annoying afternoon of my life," he said. "But hey, it made me famous, sort of." Fred and George, now businessmen and prank moguls, offered to name a special edition staircase charm in his honor. "The Thomas Loop," Fred said, raising a toast, "for those who never give up, even when the stairs hate them." And Dean, lifting his glass, replied, "Just don't sell it to muggles. They'll think they're going mad." Number 23. Soapy Flood in the Toilets. It was a Wednesday morning in early spring, a deceptively quiet time at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The clouds hung low over the towers, casting long shadows on the ancient stone walls. In the eastern corridor, the tiled floors gleamed with that eerie cleanliness that usually foretold trouble. For Fred and George Weasley, however, it was the perfect day for mischief. Armed with a small paper pouch labeled Zipow, the twins hovered near the second-floor boys' bathroom with the excited energy of inventors on the brink of greatness. The Zasoriaushchia Poroshok, which they dubbed clogging powder in their sales pitch, was their latest creation. A thick, granulated substance with a faint smell of cinnamon and sulfur, it had the miraculous ability to convert even the clearest water system into a foaming, overflowing nightmare. The idea, as George later explained with great pride, was not to destroy but to enchant, to give the unsuspecting bathroom-goer a frothy surprise. At 8:10 a.m., Fred opened the pouch and sprinkled half its contents into the lavatory bowl. George followed suit in the adjacent stall. Within seconds, the sound of gurgling pipes echoed like a warning bell. Then, with a low rumble, it began. Foam, thick as whipped cream and glittering with iridescent bubbles, surged upward. It didn't just fill the stalls, it burst out like an invading army, billowing across the tile into the corridor and up the legs of anyone unlucky enough to be near. Unbeknownst to the Weasley twins, this very morning had been marked in red ink on Professor McGonagall's calendar, the arrival of a delegation from the Ministry of Magic. 2 officials, Dolores Umbridge's assistant, Crispin Yaxley, and a lesser-known bureaucrat named Minerva Bletchley, had arrived precisely at 8 a.m. for a surprise inspection of Hogwarts' educational and sanitary facilities. Their visit was to remain confidential until their formal meeting with Dumbledore at 10, but Hogwarts, as always, had other plans. When the foam reached the far end of the corridor, it had turned from a mere prank into a catastrophic event. Students shrieked with laughter and horror as the bubbles climbed the walls and slid under classroom doors. The staircase that led to Professor Flitwick's Charms classroom was buried in white froth. Peeves, the poltergeist, sensing opportunity, began surfing on an enchanted mop, howling with glee. A second-year Hufflepuff named Barnaby Twombly was seen attempting to use an umbrella to wade through the torrent, shouting something about a sinking cauldron. Crispin Yaxley, impeccably dressed in a pinstriped cloak and carrying a clipboard charmed to tally infractions, stepped into the corridor precisely as a geyser of foam erupted from a ventilation grate. The jet hit him square in the face. His spectacles were knocked off, his clipboard vanished beneath the bubbles, and his powdered wig was later found drifting near the Slytherin common room. Beside him, Minerva Bletchley screamed, not out of fear, but outrage, as a tidal wave of magical foam enveloped her knees and quickly climbed to her elbows. She had always harbored suspicions about Dumbledore's leadership. Now, soaked in magically animated foam, her concerns had crystallized into fury. By the time Professor McGonagall arrived, her tartan dressing gown flapping as she ran, the corridor resembled a winter wonderland conjured by a madman. The foam had begun to solidify in places, forming what looked like stalactites from the ceiling. "What in Merlin's name?" she started, but was immediately silenced by a bubble that floated into her mouth and popped with a whiff of nutmeg. Upstairs in his office, Albus Dumbledore was sipping his morning tea. He had known from the moment the sun rose that today would bring chaos. Perhaps it was the unusual fluttering of the phoenix, or the way the portraits had whispered among themselves. Still, even he was not prepared for the moment when a house elf burst into his office, soaked to the ears and shrieking about a foam beast devouring the corridor. Dumbledore descended the staircase with a pace that was neither hurried nor leisurely. He walked into the east corridor like a general entering a battlefield. For the first time in months, he wore not the calm smile of an omniscient headmaster, but a look of quiet consternation. His robes, embroidered with dancing moons, began to sag under the weight of the enchanted bubbles. Fred and George, meanwhile, stood near the entrance to the bathroom, looking both triumphant and sheepish. They had not anticipated the foam's mobility, nor its speed. "A success," Fred would later whisper. "A catastrophe," George would correct him. Both were, in a sense, right. Professor Snape arrived moments later, and the sight of him covered in soap bubbles, his black hair dripping and his eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom, would live forever in the school's collective memory. "If I find out who is responsible," he began, but his threat was cut short as the floor beneath him gave way, and he sank knee-deep into a churning froth. Years later, Lee Jordan would recount the incident on the Wizarding Wireless Network with such flair that it sounded like a battle between man and monster. He described the foam as sentient and claimed that it hissed curses in Parseltongue. In reality, the only speaking came from the portraits on the walls, some of which were visibly offended at being mistaken for bathroom tiles. One of the most vivid images captured that day was by Colin Creevey, who, though not officially allowed in the East Corridor during inspections, managed to snap a photo of Professor Trelawney clinging to a chandelier with bubbles wrapped around her ankles. She later insisted It had been a vision. "The foam foretold the fall of the mighty," she intoned, swaying dramatically. What made this event more than just another Weasley prank was the official report issued by the Ministry days later. It read, in part, "The sanitation systems of Hogwarts, while archaic, exhibit unusual magical resilience. However, they are ill-suited for experimental alchemical compounds of foam-based nature." Dumbledore's response was a single line. One must allow for a little laughter, even in the presence of regulation. According to Hogwarts law, it was the only time Dumbledore ever publicly reprimanded Fred and George. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't deliver a speech. Instead, he looked at them for a long moment, then said, "Innovation without responsibility leads not to progress, but to pandemonium." The twins nodded solemnly and were then seen high-fiving as they left the office. Filch, the castle caretaker, declared the day his personal nightmare. For weeks afterward he could be heard muttering, "Foam in the torches! Foam in the stairwells! Foam in my boots!" He demanded the installation of anti-prank enchantments on all plumbing systems. Naturally, his request was denied. The foam incident, as it came to be known in the Daily Prophet, ran under the headline, "Bubble Trouble, Ministry Inspectors Drenched in Hogwarts Disaster." Rita Skeeter, ever the opportunist, wrote a scathing editorial about the decline of discipline under Dumbledore, adding speculative fluff about a secret potion ring allegedly operated from the school bathrooms. "What else bubbles beneath the surface of Hogwarts?" she asked rhetorically. Students, of course, adored the chaos. Gryffindors treated the twins like heroes. Ravenclaws attempted to reverse-engineer the powder for their own experiments. Slytherins were, in general, less amused, especially after Blaise Zabini slipped on a patch of foam and landed in a tapestry. From that day forward, the East Corridor bore the faint smell of soap no matter how many times it was scrubbed. Even the ghosts refused to float through it, claiming the foam tickled their ectoplasm. The twins themselves continued to develop their line of joke products, eventually turning the foam experiment into a legitimate product under the name Weasley's Bubble Barrage. It became a bestseller, though with a clear warning label, not for use in ministry-sanctioned buildings. Looking back, that day was more than just a prank gone awry. It was a testament to the delicate balance at Hogwarts, a place where chaos danced with tradition, where innovation often came wrapped in trouble, and where even in the face of bureaucratic inspection, the spirit of mischief could not be drowned, only foamed. And though Dumbledore rarely showed his irritation, those who were there will never forget the moment he pulled a bubble from his beard, examined it thoughtfully and whispered, "Let's hope this doesn't reach the Board of Governors." It did, but somehow it only added to Hogwarts legend. Number 24, partially invisible candy prank. It all started on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where even the paintings in Hogwarts looked too drowsy to offer sarcastic comments. The sky was the color of diluted ink, and the corridors smelled faintly of wet cloaks and dusty parchment. But inside the Gryffindor common room, Fred and George Weasley were wide awake, and more importantly, up to something. Years before opening their legendary joke shop, the twins had already begun crafting chaos in sugar form. This time, it was a new creation, experimental hard candies that they affectionately dubbed Invisibles. The name was deceptively innocent. Each small, glistening sphere promised only one thing, partial invisibility granted to any unfortunate soul who dared consume it. These weren't perfected products, not by a long shot. The twins had brewed them in secrecy using a hybrid of disillusionment charms, chameleon ghoul extract, and powdered demiguise fur, stolen, not purchased, from a potions ingredients cabinet during Slughorn's afternoon nap. Fred had nearly lost his eyebrows during the candy's first test, when George had popped one into his mouth and vanished, except for his ears, which remained oddly visible and flapping like crimson sails. The boys kept notes in a tattered journal they referred to as the Handbook of Glorious Mayhem. Page 77 was dedicated solely to the Invisibles. Effect lasts 3.2 minutes. Visibility fluctuates, reappears in reverse order, one note read, followed by a scribbled side effects, nausea, hysterics, disorientation, unexpected flatulence. Lavender Brown was never their intended victim, not initially. But as she twirled into breakfast that morning, chattering about divination and dotting her E's with hearts, the twins exchanged a glance. Fred silently slipped one of the candies into a bowl of pastel sweets she had left unattended on the Gryffindor table. George looked guilty for exactly 1 second. Then they both leaned back and waited. The Transfiguration lesson began 10 minutes later with Professor McGonagall instructing the class on the delicate process of transforming buttons into beetles. Lavender, as usual, was sitting near the front, delicately holding her wand with all the seriousness of a young noblewoman preparing to duel. But as she opened her mouth to ask a question, she suddenly gasped. Her right hand had vanished entirely. At first, the class thought it was a spell gone wrong. Lavender shrieked and dropped her wand, or would have had anyone seen where her hand had gone. It clattered to the floor from an invisible grip. Ron let out a choked snort, earning a sharp glare from Hermione. Neville took a step back, muttering something about curses, while Parvati Patil screamed in horror. Then slowly, Lavender's left arm began to fade. Her face turned an eerie translucency, as though someone had doused her in mist and erased the colour from her skin. Her mouth remained open, trembling, but now only half her lips were visible. She looked like a ghost caught between dimensions. In her panic, she stumbled backward, knocking over a stool. Professor McGonagall dropped her wand, utterly stunned, then recovered her composure within seconds, as only McGonagall could. "Miss Brown, stay calm," she instructed. "This appears to be magical interference." But Lavender was far from calm. She let out a wail, convinced that she was cursed. Tears spilled from one visible eye, the other half lost to transparency. At the back of the room, Fred and George Weasley were practically vibrating with silent laughter. George had pulled out a quill and was furiously jotting down notes. "Right arm fades first," he scribbled. "Facial transparency uneven, psychological distress high, response, tears and shrieking." They would later describe this as a successful trial. The chaos escalated when Seamus Finnegan tried to perform a counter-charm and accidentally caused Lavender's left leg to disappear as well. Now sobbing uncontrollably, Lavender collapsed into a chair she couldn't see, hugging her one remaining visible limb. Hermione Granger stood up, furious. This had gone beyond a joke. "Someone did this on purpose," she said sharply, and her eyes were scanning the room like a seeker after a snitch. She had seen the way Fred and George had elbowed each other at breakfast. She'd noticed the giggling behind parchment shields, and most of all, she was smart enough to know that partial invisibility wasn't just a fluke of magic, it was designed. "Professor," she said, her voice clear and cold, "I think the headmaster needs to be informed." Fred and George didn't giggle any more after that. Well, not loudly. Dumbledore arrived before the bell rang. One would expect the headmaster to be stern, but instead he surveyed Lavender's semi-invisible form with an expression of fascinated sympathy. "Ah," he murmured, "an invisibility anomaly, quite advanced. And lemon-scented?" The twins tried to escape the classroom unnoticed, but McGonagall's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Weasley, both of you," she said crisply. "Sit down." Dumbledore examined the candy in question, still half dissolved in Lavender's mouth. "Delightfully clever," he said after a moment, "though ethically questionable." Hermione was having none of the charm. "It's dangerous. What if she'd eaten too? What if she'd fallen down the stairs?" Fred raised a hand. One of the few times in his life he did so in class. "Actually, sir," he said, "that's why we only used a quarter dose." George nodded. "It was all very scientifically controlled." Lavender, who had now reappeared in full but was still hiccuping through sobs, glared at them with all the hatred of a jilted valentine. Her hair was a mess, her robes rumpled, and her trust in candy forever broken. The punishment came swiftly. McGonagall gave the twins 2 weeks of detention, during which they were required to scrub every single trophy in the trophy room by hand, without magic, but the damage to their reputation was minimal. If anything, the Invisibles became the stuff of legend. Even Lee Jordan would later whisper they actually made someone disappear. Sort of. That's next level. The Weasleys took their notes and improved the formula. By their final year, they had created versions that allowed selective transparency, perfect for sneaking into kitchens or avoiding Peeves. They even offered a prototype to Harry, who politely declined after remembering Lavender's panicked expression and the way her fingers had shimmered like smoke. Somewhere deep in Hogwarts history, the event earned an unofficial title, the Vanishing Girl Incident. Future students whispered about it whenever a new prank started to gain traction. Lavender herself never ate anything Fred and George offered her again, not even a chocolate frog. But perhaps the most interesting part of the whole affair was Dumbledore's private note, later found in his papers. Fred and George Weasley possessed the rare talent of magical innovation. Dangerous, yes, but driven by imagination. If nurtured wisely, they could achieve wonders or war. The Invisibles never made it to the shelves of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, too unpredictable, too likely to cause lawsuits. But their legacy remained in the laughter of dormitories, the caution of sweets left unattended, and the faint shimmer of magic when no one was looking. Even Hermione had to admit years later that it had been ingenious, albeit appallingly irresponsible. The school nurse, Madame Pomfrey, had her hands full that day, not with injuries. Lavender recovered quickly, but with calming down a stream of panicked students, convinced they were also fading. "It's psychosomatic," she muttered, shoving calming draughts into trembling hands. "Not every sneeze is a curse." Fred and George were unrepentant. "Progress," they said, grinning. "Can't happen without a few accidents." They still had the original candy mold, etched with swirls and tiny letters spelling poof. It sat on their desk next to a jar labelled Mystery Batch No. 3, which glowed faintly in the dark and made a high-pitched humming sound. Years later, long after Fred's tragic death, George would find the old notes. He would read the scribbled observations with a soft smile and a heavy heart. And one evening, when the shop was closed and the rain tapped gently on the windows, he would drop an invisible into his tea. Just to see. And in the mirror behind the counter, his reflection would flicker, just slightly, one arm fading, then returning. Like a ghost waving goodbye, like a memory, too stubborn to disappear completely. Number 25. The Snoring Goose Pillow Curse. Fred and George Weasley had always been known for their endless sense of mischief. Even in a school full of magical chaos and enchanted oddities, their pranks had a particular flavour, equal parts brilliant and outrageous. They were the beating heart of laughter in Gryffindor Tower, known to turn even the dullest day into a spectacle. But one particular prank played during their 5th year took a darker turn than even they anticipated. It involved a quiet boy from Ravenclaw named Sam Turpey and a spellbound pillow that would become infamous as the source of the so-called curse of snoring. Sam Turpey was the kind of boy who blended into the background. With narrow shoulders, a nose perpetually buried in old books, and a voice barely louder than a whisper, Sam rarely attracted attention. He kept to himself, especially at night, when the Ravenclaw dormitory echoed with the sounds of page-flipping soft sighs and occasionally the rhythmic snore of tired students. Sam's own snoring, though not terribly loud, had been the subject of some teasing among his roommates. It was Fred and George who turned the teasing into torment. It began innocently, as most things do. Fred had overheard one of the Ravenclaw boys grumbling about how Sam muttered strange things in his sleep. George, ever ready for theatricality, had an idea. That night, using a charm of their own invention, vox vocis somni, a variation of the sonorous spell, they enchanted Sam's pillow to mimic his own voice. But they didn't stop at simple muttering. They added a ridiculous phrase, one that would become a legend in the corridors of Hogwarts. "I'm a magical goose. I fly in my dreams." The first night it happened, the Ravenclaw dormitory erupted in stunned silence, followed by raucous laughter. Sam, startled awake by the sound of his own voice echoing off the stone walls, stared in horror as the others clutched their sides. The pillow had spoken in perfect imitation, as though Sam himself had proudly declared his goosehood. The prank repeated for 3 nights. Each time Sam began to snore, the pillow would wait a few moments before blurting out the enchanted line, sometimes louder, sometimes in a sing-song voice. The charm was clever. It was triggered by the unique frequency of Sam's snoring, and no spell from the standard curriculum could detect the enchantment. By the 3rd night, Sam had become the dormitory's favourite joke. In the great hall, whispers followed him. Someone conjured a paper goose to waddle after him between classes. A second year from Hufflepuff charmed a quill to honk every time Sam spoke. Even the ghosts caught wind of the story. Peeves, in particular, was delighted. He took to floating above Sam's head, shouting, "Fly, goose boy, fly!" Sam's reaction wasn't theatrical. He didn't yell or cry. Instead, his silence deepened. He skipped meals, spoke only when asked, and requested to study in the library after hours to avoid the dormitory. Professor Flitwick, ever sensitive to the moods of his house, noticed the change. When he asked Sam directly, the boy merely said he didn't sleep well anymore. It wasn't until the 5th night, when Sam refused to return to the dormitory at all, that Flitwick began a quiet investigation. The truth was uncovered during a staff meeting. Professor McGonagall, who had confiscated a number of experimental joke products from the Weasley twins that week, mentioned hearing a bizarre spell phrase during a disciplinary hearing. Flitwick, curious, approached her after the meeting and asked what phrase it had been. When he heard vox vocis somni, his suspicions were confirmed. Fred and George, summoned to Flitwick's office, arrived with their usual swagger. But Flitwick's mood was not one to be trifled with. Though small in stature, he could make a room tremble with a single glare. "You may find laughter in the suffering of others," he told them that day, "but I do not. You will learn the difference." He handed them each a scroll, 100 lines of magical transcription to copy, detailing the ethical use of enchantments. But that wasn't the end of it. More importantly, Sam was moved to a smaller dormitory near the Ravenclaw Tower's west wing, a rarely used guest chamber with a single bed and a view of the Black Lake. Flitwick brewed for him a delicate, calming draught laced with essence of silver birch and feather fern, an old recipe that was said to ease troubled sleep. For 3 weeks, Sam drank it nightly, and slowly the shadows under his eyes began to fade. Though the teasing eventually stopped, the mark it left on Sam lingered. He became more withdrawn than ever. He stopped attending group classes whenever possible, preferring private instruction. Even Professor Sprout noted that her normally eager herbology student had taken to working alone in the far corner of the greenhouse. One winter afternoon, while working in the greenhouses, Sam discovered a frost-fragile plant known as dream willow, whose seeds shimmered with a silvery mist. He spent weeks cultivating them, whispering to them, tending them with a care that made Professor Sprout tear up. "It's rare," she told Dumbledore later, "to see such love given to something that cannot speak back." It was in the spring that Sam began to recover. The pillow incident had become a distant memory for most students, but the staff remembered. Flitwick, in particular, watched closely. He noted that Sam had begun tutoring a few first years in arithmancy and helping Madame Pince organize rare book scrolls in the library. Quietly, Sam had become a cornerstone of kindness in the quieter corners of Hogwarts. Fred and George, for their part, never pulled another prank quite like it again. "We meant it to be funny," George later admitted to Lee Jordan. "We didn't realize how much a laugh could hurt." They made a quiet effort to apologize, not with words, because they knew Sam wasn't looking for apologies, but through gestures. They left anonymous packages of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes gear outside his door with careful notes, no sound spells included. Years later, when they opened their joke shop in Diagon Alley, One of their most popular items was a plush goose that honked random phrases when squeezed. Fred insisted it wasn't related. George just smiled. But the original prototype, charmed with the very spell they'd once used on Sam's pillow, sat in a glass case behind the register, labelled "Retired Model. Do not use." Beneath it, a small card read, "Laughter should never come at someone's peace." What made this tale resonate within the Hogwarts rumour mills wasn't simply the mischief, it was the transformation. The school had seen countless pranks, from trick staircases to animated paintings turning obscene, but this one had reminded students and staff alike of a deeper truth. Magic, like words, could wound. Even Dumbledore, in one of his rare, quietly philosophical remarks, was said to have referenced it in a conversation with a group of seventh years. "In dreams," he said, "we reveal our deepest fears and longings. To ridicule those dreams is to strike at the heart of someone's spirit." Sam graduated with honours, eventually joining the Department of Mysteries, where he became one of the youngest unspeakables in modern wizarding history. Those who knew him at school often spoke of his transformation, not with awe, but with a sense of quiet pride. "He never became bitter," one Ravenclaw alum said. "He just grew stronger." As for the spell Vox Vocis Somni, it was never published in the official registry of Hogwarts spellwork. Flitwick, when asked about it by a curious third year decades later, simply chuckled and said, "Some magics are better left forgotten." But among the staff archives, sealed in a folder marked "Educational Disciplinary Cases," a single parchment remains. It contains the original incantation, a scribbled version of the charm's construction, and a short note in Flitwick's hand. "A lesson in laughter. Let this never be repeated." And so the tale of the magical goose lives on, not in laughter, but in memory. A prank that flew too far, a curse born not of dark arts, but of careless amusement, and a boy who, through silence and time, taught Hogwarts one of its most unexpected lessons. Number 26, Ink That Rewrites Essays. Fred and George Weasley were not just pranksters. They were pioneers of magical mischief, artists of disruption, and curators of chaos. Long before Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became a Diagon Alley sensation, their genius was already fermenting in the quiet corridors of Hogwarts. Among their countless inventions, one stood out not for its theatricality, but for its subtle, insidious brilliance: the Confounding ink. It was a quiet spell woven into the heart of a mundane object, a bottle of ink, designed not to explode or turn the user blue, but to betray them with every written word. The ink was simple to the eye, a perfectly ordinary shade of black, resting calmly in a glass bottle with a pewter lid. But beneath that still surface was a charm that corrupted not the quill, but the intention of the writer. The moment ink touched parchment, it began to reshape the thoughts it was supposed to capture. A line on magical theory would morph into poetic drivel. A historical date would become a heartfelt confession. It was mischief done in silence, discovered only when it was far too late to undo. The victims were meant to be random. The twins had initially intended to leave the bottle unattended in the Gryffindor common room, letting fate choose its fool. But then came a tempting opportunity too perfect to ignore. Hermione Granger, the most diligent, most precise, and most intolerant of all things unserious, sat alone by the fire, head bent over her parchment, quill flying with determined fury. She was drafting a 2-foot-long essay on complex summoning spells for Professor Flitwick's class. The twins exchanged a glance, and in that silent exchange, a decision was made. Hermione's original ink had just run out. She muttered something about needing to refill and left the parchment unattended. In a moment that would make Peeves himself proud, George reached into his robes, extracted the bottle of confounding ink, and placed it where Hermione's ink had been. There was no flash of light, no hiss of transformation. Just a quiet substitution, the calm before a storm she didn't yet know she had summoned. She returned, dipped her quill, and resumed writing. From her point of view, nothing had changed. The letters formed as usual, the sentences flowed smoothly, and the ink dried quickly on the parchment. But what she thought she was writing, and what actually appeared, were catastrophically different. Her discussion of the Levicorpus spell's historical applications became instead a rambling admiration. Levicorpus is quite romantic under a moonlit sky. Her carefully crafted analysis of Flitwick's teaching method now praised his adorable height and fantastic ears. When she finally handed in her essay the next morning, Professor Flitwick looked baffled, then amused, then deeply concerned. His high-pitched voice called her to stay after class, and the resulting conversation was not one Hermione would ever recount. Though no formal punishment was given, there was talk of misconduct, and the risk of Gryffindor losing house points loomed large. The look Hermione gave the twins that afternoon could have shattered glass. Fred and George, seasoned as they were in escaping blame, avoided the library for the next week. The usually spirited Gryffindor common room grew tense whenever Hermione entered. She walked with the poise of someone who had been publicly humiliated and was plotting revenge with the clinical precision of a potions master. The fact that she couldn't prove the ink had been tampered with, because the confounding ink vanished from the bottle within 24 hours, only made things worse. The prank might have faded into the background if not for the ripple effect it caused. Hermione, determined to clear her name, went on a relentless campaign to uncover how such a mistake had occurred. She reviewed her own notes, cross-referenced them with texts in the library, and even interrogated her fellow Gryffindors, hoping someone had seen the ink switch. No one confessed. Fred and George, under tight-lipped discipline, refused even to smirk in her presence. But every now and then, a first year might find their homework turned into a love letter to McGonagall, or a footnote expressing admiration for Filch's fashion sense, signs that the ink had more uses yet. What made the confounding ink so dangerous was not the chaos it caused, but the kind of chaos. Unlike a dung bomb or a nosebleed nougat, the effects were intellectual, emotional. Embarrassing not because of physical discomfort, but because they struck at one's pride, reputation, and identity. For someone like Hermione, who based her entire self-image on intelligence and discipline, it was a targeted strike, a betrayal not by another person, but by her own hand. Fred later noted in one of their early product catalogue drafts, "The best pranks make you doubt reality, the best pranks make you doubt yourself." The confounding ink did both. It was eventually banned from Hogwarts grounds, though the twins never admitted to its creation. Years later, when their shop was flourishing, a version of it, renamed Quill's Confession No. 9, appeared on their shelves, advertised as Truth Serum for Parchment. Professor McGonagall, though never directly involved in the incident, had a hunch about the source. She lectured Hermione sternly on the importance of rereading one's essays before submission, but added, in a rare moment of warmth, "Even the most brilliant minds are prone to sabotage, especially from those who envy structure." Her words, though meant to console, only deepened Hermione's sense of injustice. She didn't believe the twins envied her. She believed they targeted her because she represented everything they rejected. Ron found the incident hilarious, though he tried to hide it. "At least they didn't charm your essay to smell like old socks," he muttered once. Harry offered more sympathy, but even he had to admit, privately, that the line about Flitwick's ears was very specific. There was something eerily convincing about the rewritten phrases, as if they hadn't been composed by a trick, but by some deeper subconscious mischief. That only made Hermione more suspicious. What if the ink revealed more than it concealed? The idea haunted her. She found herself obsessively reviewing old essays, worried that she had accidentally said something foolish in the past. Her notebooks became battlegrounds for control. Every sentence she wrote was now double-checked. Her writing style became more rigid, more cautious. It wasn't just a prank, it had changed her. Eventually the moment passed. Time and exams and other crises, including Buckbeak's trial and Sirius Black's reappearance, swept the incident into memory. But Hermione never again used an ink bottle that wasn't purchased personally and tested under multiple charms. She developed, in her later years, a proprietary ink detection spell, which she tried to submit to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It was declined, but the paperwork now circulates in select underground circles under the unofficial name Granger's Vow. The Weasley twins never recreated that exact ink. As their careers moved toward large-scale joke products and defense gear for the war, the more insidious psychological pranks became rare, but every now and then a Hogwarts student would hand in an essay with peculiar phrases, the kind that suggested the legacy of confounding ink had not quite died out. Whether these were copycats or artifacts from the original batch was never determined. The Hogwarts rumour mill kept the legend alive. Students whispered about the haunted essay that turned a Hufflepuff's herbology homework into a sonnet to Professor Sprout. Others claimed to have seen a Ravenclaw burst into tears after reading their own rewritten summary on Transfiguration. Each tale, true or not, added weight to the mythos. The ink had become folklore, the written ghost of a joke too perfect to be fully destroyed. What made the prank unforgettable wasn't just the effect or even the target, it was the fact that it revealed the power of words, how even the smartest witch of her age could be undone by a few well-placed lines. In a world where magic could move mountains, Fred and George proved that the pen, quite literally, was mightier than the wand. In the grand catalogue of Hogwarts hijinks, from talking toilets to sentient staircases, few artifacts ever matched the subtlety of confounding ink. It was a reminder that not all curses come with a flash of green light. Some come with compliments that sting worse than insults. Years later, when George ran the shop alone, he would sometimes pause in front of the shelf labelled Legacy Products. He rarely touched the bottle with the faded label marked CI1, but once, when a customer asked for the most legendary prank in their entire archive, he reached for it. He held the bottle up to the light, watching the ink shift like a living shadow. "Be careful with this one," he said, half to himself. "It doesn't just change your writing, it changes you." And somewhere in the bowels of Hogwarts, perhaps in the restricted section, or hidden behind a loose brick near the Gryffindor fireplace, another bottle waits, small, silent, and impossibly still. A trap not of force but of phrasing, a whisper on parchment, a secret written in plain sight. Number 27, staircase leading to a locked closet. It was a rainy Thursday in October when the first student disappeared. At precisely 8:42 a.m., just after breakfast, and moments before Charms class, Alicia Brookstone, a fourth-year Ravenclaw, hurried up the grand marble staircase, clutching a book too large for her satchel and mumbling last-minute spells under her breath. As she reached the third step, the staircase groaned, a sound common in the ever-shifting architecture of Hogwarts, and twisted slightly, as if hesitating. Then, instead of turning left toward the Charms corridor, it veered right and pitched downward. Before Alicia could regain her balance, she found herself pushed through an unfamiliar door which slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed the space. A second later, a heavy click echoed as the lock turned. The cupboard was narrow, musty, and untouched by time. Wooden shelves lined with broken brooms and rusted cauldrons loomed in the dark. The smell of dust and mildew invaded her nostrils. For 10 whole minutes, Alicia remained trapped inside, her wand clutched tightly, her breath shallow. She attempted a lumos, but the thick shadows seemed to absorb the light. When the door finally opened on its own, she stumbled out, pale and shaken. She wasn't alone in her misfortune. That very afternoon, second-year Hufflepuff Stuart Munch tried to catch up to his friends on the 5th floor. In his haste, he barely noticed the shifting direction of the staircase beneath his feet. Just like Alicia, he was rerouted not toward the astronomy tower, but into the same wretched cupboard. His panicked banging echoed through the empty corridor above, but no one heard him until the door creaked open 10 minutes later. Stuart emerged with tears streaming down his face, arms scratched from falling against splintered wood. But it was the third victim that nearly turned a prank into a scandal. Oliver Wimple, a first-year Gryffindor, was still adjusting to life at Hogwarts. He'd never known magic before. Raised by his Muggle grandmother in Sheffield, the enchanted castle was both wondrous and terrifying. The incident occurred on Friday morning. Oliver had woken up early, determined not to be late to Transfiguration. Professor McGonagall had a fierce reputation. He took the wrong staircase, or so he thought. But the castle betrayed him. As soon as Oliver stepped onto the staircase, it jolted forward. The walls around him seemed to ripple as if alive. He tried to turn back, but the stairs became a ramp, sliding him uncontrollably toward the cupboard. The door flung open, swallowing him like a beast. When it shut, the click of the lock echoed like a prison gate. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Oliver dropped his wand. The walls felt like they were closing in. His breaths became short, then rapid. Panic overtook him. He began to sob. It took nearly an hour to calm him after the door opened. Professor Sprout, summoned by a terrified student who found Oliver crouched in the hallway, sat with him in the greenhouse for the rest of the morning, offering warm tea and gentle reassurances. "I thought it was some kind of punishment," Oliver reportedly told her. "I thought the castle didn't want me here." The incident triggered widespread concern. Rumours flew like enchanted parchment birds through the common rooms. Was it Peeves? Was it a rogue enchantment? Students began avoiding certain staircases. Prefects reported dozens of younger students refusing to move between floors without escorts. An emergency staff meeting was called that evening. Professor McGonagall took swift and furious action. As deputy headmistress, she oversaw an unprecedented inspection of all 142 staircases in Hogwarts. "It is the duty of this institution to provide not only education, but safety," she reportedly declared. "We will not allow mischief to override protection." Every enchanted path was examined, every hidden corridor mapped. The staircases groaned under magical scrutiny. It was during these inspections that Filch, the cantankerous caretaker, unearthed the truth, entirely by accident. While investigating a broom closet near the third-floor corridor, he tripped on a small metallic sphere. It rolled across the floor, stopped, and began vibrating. It was a trick detonator, commonly used for triggering pranks. He brought it to Professor Flitwick, who identified the enchantments layered within: misdirection, auto-locking charm, and a timed release. Only 3 students at Hogwarts had the skill and audacity to create such a device. Fred and George Weasley, 6th-year Gryffindors, had long been legends of laughter and chaos. They'd once enchanted all the suits of armour in the castle to sing Christmas carols in August. They were banned from the owlery for replacing the owl pellets with fake howlers. And now, apparently, they had turned their talents to manipulating the castle's very foundation. When confronted, Fred and George didn't deny it. Their defense was simple. It was only meant for a laugh. According to Professor McGonagall's later report, their enchantment had been designed to target anyone moving too quickly on the staircase, those who were clearly in a rush. "We wanted to teach people not to run in the castle," George reportedly said. "It was supposed to be a 10-minute lesson in slowing down." But that lesson had nearly traumatized a first year and sent another to the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey treated Alicia for mild shock and Stuart for bruised ribs. The line between mischief and danger had been crossed. Hogwarts had always tolerated a certain level of chaos. After all, as Dumbledore himself once said, "Youth cannot know how age thinks and feels, but old men are guilty if they forget what it was to be young." Yet even Dumbledore, often indulgent with the twins, agreed disciplinary action was needed. The punishment was both inventive and humiliating. For the next month, Fred and George were stripped of all Hogsmeade privileges and required to assist Filch in cleaning every stairwell in the castle without magic. Fred later told Lee Jordan that it was the most painful month of his life. "Not the cleaning," he clarified, "but being that close to Filch for that long. I nearly hexed myself just for a break." More importantly, McGonagall ordered that no student be allowed to tamper with the school's structural enchantments again. Special wards were placed on the staircases keyed to staff-only wands. The cupboard itself, once forgotten, was sealed permanently and relocated, yes, relocated, to the Room of Requirement. It would remain there, locked in magical stasis. the incident sparked a larger conversation among the faculty. How much freedom should be granted to magical youth? Hogwarts had always balanced discipline with wonder, danger with discovery. But the event marked a turning point. Safety protocols became tighter. Dumbledore implemented a new set of prank evaluation procedures, with Flitwick leading the committee. "If we can't stop them," he said, "we may as well supervise them." Students whispered about the event for weeks. Some admired the twins even more. "They enchanted a staircase," one third-year marveled. "Do you know how hard that is?" Others, especially the younger ones, saw them differently. Oliver Wimple never walked the staircases alone again. His best friend, Jacob, always waited at the top and bottom of every shift. The castle had betrayed his trust, and no apology could quite restore it. Fred and George did eventually apologize, not with words, but action. That Christmas, every student received a small enchanted trinket, a candy frog that sang lullabies, a snow globe that played Hogwarts anthem, a joke quill that corrected spelling instead of making snide comments. On the bottom of each was a label, Weasley and Weasley, mischief, but mindful. Years later, after they left Hogwarts, when their joke shop in Diagon Alley became a booming success, they often told the story of the cursed cupboard with a mix of pride and regret. "That one taught us something," Fred once said. "Not just about magic, but about responsibility. If you can enchant a castle, you better know what kind of echo you leave in its halls." The cupboard remained sealed, but occasionally, especially late at night when the corridors were quiet and the portraits slept, one could still hear the faint creak of a staircase shifting in the dark, as if the castle remembered, as if it too had learned something that day. And in the Gryffindor common room, long after Fred and George had graduated, a small plaque appeared above the fireplace. No one admitted to hanging it. It read, "For those who run, for those who rush, beware the stairs that hush. The cupboard waits not for feet, but for folly." In the end, it was not just a prank, it was a chapter in Hogwarts' living memory. Another story whispered through generations, another spell etched into the ever-shifting soul of the school. 28. Anti-gravity potion in the Great Hall. It started, as many of the most memorable Hogwarts catastrophes did, with the Weasley twins and a bubbling cauldron hidden deep in the shadows of the Room of Requirement. Fred had smuggled in a pinch of powdered diricawl feather, while George, his eyes sparkling with mischief, carefully added the extract of levitating lichen, a rare ingredient found only on the undersides of floating islands in the Scottish Highlands. The resulting concoction shimmered with a silvery blue glow, pulsating softly like the heartbeat of a dream. They called it gravitas nullum, a potion that defied one of nature's most stubborn laws. Their plan was simple in concept and outrageous in execution. At precisely noon during Tuesday's lunch, the potion, already sealed into a thin ampule of dragonglass, would be released over the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall. It would disperse into a fine, nearly invisible mist, affecting the gravitational field of the room for exactly 5 minutes, long enough to cause absolute chaos, but short enough, they hoped, to avoid permanent damage or expulsion. As the enchanted ceiling displayed the soft clouds of a mid-autumn sky, the ampule shattered silently above the floating candles, sending a near-magical haze swirling downward. For the first minute, nothing happened. Then, as Ron Weasley was lifting a spoonful of treacle tart to his mouth, his body gave a sudden jolt. His seat lifted an inch from the floor. He blinked, confused. Across the hall, Hannah Abbott gasped as her pumpkin juice floated up in shimmering spheres. The great hall erupted into a symphony of shrieks, laughter, and clattering silverware. Within seconds, entire groups of students began rising from their benches, chairs tipping and spinning as gravity lost its grip. Justin Finch Fletchley clutched at the edge of the Gryffindor table but floated sideways, his tie flapping like a flag. Plates, goblets, roasted chickens, and stacks of treacle tarts spun lazily in the air, creating a surreal constellation of food and students. The house banners rippled unnaturally, tugged upward as if yearning for the sky. And then came the scream. A Hufflepuff first year named Elspeth Marlowe, barely 4 feet tall and in her second month at Hogwarts, shot into the air like a balloon let loose at a birthday party. Her hands flailed wildly. No one was close enough to help. Elspeth spun, arms outstretched, eyes wide with terror. Her path intersected disastrously with one of the brass chandeliers. A heavy clang echoed through the hall as her foot struck the curved metal. The chandelier swung, flickering, as Elspeth spun off, landing with a stomach-turning plop into a massive communal bowl of mashed potatoes at the staff table. Professor Sprout let out a yelp and rushed to her side. Professor McGonagall stood frozen, her mouth a tight line, nostrils flaring with silent fury. She lifted her wand, summoning ropes to gently tether the floating students and prevent further collisions. But Fred and George's potion was potent, and it didn't care much for rules or ropes. Above them, Neville Longbottom was gently orbiting the enchanted ceiling, his robes puffed like sails. He bumped into one of the floating candles, which promptly set the hem of his robes smouldering. Professor Flitwick, squeaking in panic, cast a rapid sequence of spells to douse the flame and lower Neville safely to the floor. But gravity wasn't done misbehaving. Colin Creevey, camera ever in hand, had risen just high enough to capture the chaos from a unique angle. His camera floated beside him, capturing blurry images of upturned tables, levitating potatoes, and Peeves, the poltergeist, zipping through the scene, gleefully shouting, "Up we go, floaty heads!" Peeves began collecting floating forks and knives and throwing them like javelins toward the Slytherin table, cackling madly. Fred and George, hovering near the upper rafters and holding on to a banner that read, "Magical mischief is the best medicine," watched with a mix of pride and dawning horror. Fred looked down and saw Professor McGonagall's wand, glowing with a dark, crackling energy. She wasn't amused, not even slightly.